Look at your hands right now. Hold them up in front of your face and really examine them. Those fingers, that skin, the blood pumping through your veins. What you are looking at is nothing short of a miracle. You are witnessing the end result of the most unlikely survival story in human history. The DNA in every single cell of your body carries a secret that will change how you see yourself forever. You almost never existed. 74,000 years ago, your genetic lineage was 30 seconds away from total extinction. Not from war, not from disease, not from some asteroid crashing into Earth. Your ancestors were nearly wiped out by a mountain in Indonesia that literally tried to delete humanity from existence. And here is the part that should terrify you. It is about to happen again. Your government knows this. Scientists have been tracking it for decades. And everything they have told you about being prepared for the next global catastrophe is a lie designed to prevent mass panic. Because the truth is, when Mount Toba erupts again, and it will, most of the people listening to this will not survive the first week. But let me start with what really happened to your family, because that is what this is. This is not ancient history happening to strangers. This is your family story, written in DNA and carved into the genetic code of every person alive today. Genetic studies completed just last year have proven something that changes everything we thought we knew about human survival. At one point in our species' history, the entire human population was reduced to fewer than 1,000 breeding pairs. 1,000. To put that in perspective, there are more people in a typical shopping mall on a Saturday afternoon than there were humans left alive on the entire planet. You are more closely related to every person on Earth than most animals in the same species are to each other. Every person you have ever met, every stranger you pass on the street, every celebrity you see on television, they are all your cousins. Distant cousins, but cousins nonetheless. And you all share the same incredible survival story. The event that nearly erased your bloodline from existence was not just a volcanic eruption. It was the closest thing to nuclear war that the planet had ever experienced, except the weapon was not built by humans. It was built by the Earth itself, deep beneath what is now Indonesia, in a place that seems peaceful and beautiful today, but hides one of the most dangerous geological features on the planet. Mount Toba does not look like the volcanoes you see in movies. There is no dramatic cone shape, no obvious crater smoking ominously in the distance. Instead, there is a serene lake surrounded by lush tropical forests. Tourists visit this place to take selfies and enjoy the scenery. They have no idea they are standing on top of a weapon of mass destruction that has already fired once and is quietly reloading for its next shot. The eruption that occurred 74,000 years ago was not just bigger than anything in recorded human history. It was bigger than anything the modern world can comprehend. We measure volcanic eruptions on something called the Volcanic Explosivity Index, which goes from 0 to 8. Most eruptions that make the news are somewhere between a 2 and a 4. The eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980, which seemed catastrophic at the time, was only a 5. Toba was an 8, the maximum possible rating. To understand what that means, imagine taking every nuclear weapon that has ever been built by every country on Earth and detonating them all at the same time. That would still not equal the explosive power of what happened at Toba 74,000 years ago. But the explosion was just the beginning. What happened next is what nearly ended your family line forever. When Toba erupted, it did not just blow up. It collapsed inward, creating a crater so massive that it eventually filled with water to become the lake that exists today. But before that happened, the eruption launched so much material into the atmosphere that it blocked out the sun, not for days or weeks, but for years. Imagine waking up one morning and the sun never comes up. The sky remains gray and dark, ash falls like snow for months, and temperatures across the entire planet drop by 15 degrees Celsius almost overnight. That is what your ancestors experienced. A nuclear winter without the nuclear war. The volcanic ash was not just annoying dust that you could sweep away. It was like microscopic glass, sharp enough to shred lung tissue if you breathed it in, heavy enough to collapse roofs when it accumulated, and toxic enough to poison water supplies for hundreds of miles in every direction. But even that was not the worst part. The worst part was what happened to the climate. The sulfur dioxide released by the eruption combined with water vapor in the upper atmosphere to create a global reflective haze that bounced sunlight back into space. For nearly a decade, Earth experienced what scientists call a volcanic winter. Growing seasons failed, forests died, animals starved, and humans, your ancestors, found themselves living in a world that had suddenly become almost uninhabitable. This was not a gradual climate change that species could adapt to over thousands of years. This was an overnight transformation that gave our ancestors no time to evolve new survival strategies through natural selection. They had to adapt behaviorally, culturally, and technologically in real time, or they would die. Most of them died. Recent genetic analysis has revealed the true scope of this catastrophe in a way that previous generations of scientists could never have imagined. By studying the DNA of people from every continent and every ethnic background, researchers have been able to trace the genetic bottleneck that occurred around the time of the TOBA eruption. The results are staggering. The entire human population, which had been growing and spreading across Africa and into other continents, suddenly crashed to numbers so low that we nearly went extinct. Every person alive today descends from that tiny group of survivors. Your genetic diversity is so limited compared to other species that cheetahs, who are famous for their lack of genetic variation, have more genetic diversity than humans do. You are the descendant of the ultimate refugees. Climate refugees fleeing the world's first nuclear winter. Your ancestors were not just tough or lucky. They were the product of the most intense natural selection event in human history. Only the most adaptable, most cooperative, most innovative humans survived. And their traits, their survival instincts, their capacity for cooperation under extreme stress is coded into your DNA. But here is what the documentaries will not tell you, what the scientific papers gloss over, and what your government absolutely does not want you to understand. The genetic changes that allowed your ancestors to survive TOBA did not just help them get through that crisis. Those changes made them different from every other human who had lived before. The TOBA eruption did not just nearly end humanity. It created a new kind of human. The humans who survived TOBA had enhanced cognitive abilities compared to their predecessors. They had to. The old ways of thinking, the old ways of solving problems, the old ways of organizing society were not sufficient for survival in a world turned upside down. They had to innovate in real time or die. Archaeological evidence shows that the toolkit of human technology changed dramatically after TOBA. Tools became more sophisticated, more specialized, more efficient. Art and symbolic thinking exploded in complexity. Social organization became more elaborate. Language probably became more complex as well, though we cannot prove that from the archaeological record. What we can prove is that the humans who emerged from the TOBA crisis were not the same species that went into it. They were smarter, more creative, more cooperative, and more technologically sophisticated. In other words, they were more like modern humans and less like the earlier hominids who had dominated the planet for millions of years. You are not just the descendant of TOBA survivors, you are the descendant of the first truly modern humans, forged in the crucible of the greatest natural disaster in our species' history. And that disaster is about to happen again. The monitoring systems that governments use to track volcanic activity show clear signs that we are entering another period of increased supervolcanic risk. Yellowstone National Park sits on top of a magma chamber that is showing disturbing signs of activity. Ground levels have been rising and falling by meters over the past few decades as magma moves beneath the surface. Earthquake swarms have become more frequent. Gas emissions have changed in ways that indicate increasing pressure underground. But Yellowstone is not the only threat. The TOBA system itself is still active. Lake TOBA may look peaceful, but it sits on top of the same geological hotspot that produced the eruption 74,000 years ago. Seismic monitoring shows regular earthquake activity in the region. The magma chamber has not disappeared. It is just sleeping. Scientists have identified at least 47 potential supervolcanic systems around the world that could produce eruptions similar to TOBA. Most of them are being monitored, but the monitoring systems are primitive compared to what would be needed to give adequate warning of an impending eruption. The global food system would collapse within months of a major supervolcanic eruption. Not because there would not be enough food in total, but because the distribution systems that move food around the world depend on stable weather patterns, functioning transportation networks, and predictable growing seasons. A supervolcanic winter would disrupt all of those systems simultaneously. Urban populations would face starvation within weeks. Rural populations would fare better initially, but as refugees from the cities moved into agricultural areas, competition for resources would become violent very quickly. The government studies predict widespread social collapse within the first year of a supervolcanic event. But the classified studies also reveal something else, something that should give you hope and should change how you think about your own capabilities. The same genetic adaptations that allowed your ancestors to survive TOBA are still present in your DNA. They are mostly dormant under normal circumstances, but they can be activated by the right kind of stress. Modern humans have not lost the survival instincts of their TOBA ancestors. We have just not had occasion to use them. But when pushed to the limit, when faced with genuine survival challenges, humans still display the same remarkable adaptability that carried our species through the volcanic winter. The question is not whether you have the genetic potential to survive another supervolcanic event. You do. The question is whether you will recognize that potential and develop it before you need it, or whether you will wait until the ash starts falling and try to figure it out in real time. Your ancestors had advantages that you do not have. They lived in small groups where everyone knew everyone else and cooperation was automatic. They had extensive knowledge of wild plants and animals that could be used for food and medicine. They were accustomed to living without the technological support systems that modern humans depend on for survival. But you have advantages that they did not have. You have access to scientific knowledge about what is coming and how it will unfold. You have technologies that could help you survive if you know how to use them properly. You have the ability to prepare in advance rather than just reacting to crisis as it unfolds. The problem is that most people are not preparing for the right kind of crisis. They are preparing for temporary emergencies that last days or weeks. They are not preparing for the kind of long-term civilizational collapse that a supervolcanic winter would produce. The government emergency preparedness guidelines tell you to have 3 days worth of food and water. 3 days. For a disaster that would last 3 to 6 years, the disconnect between official preparedness advice and the actual scale of the threat is so enormous that it can only be explained as deliberate misinformation designed to prevent panic. But panic might actually be the appropriate response. Panic that motivates action, that drives innovation, that forces people to take the threat seriously and prepare accordingly. The survivors of TOBA were not calm and collected. They were probably terrified most of the time, but their terror motivated them to do whatever it took to stay alive. Modern humans have been conditioned to believe that someone else will solve their problems for them, that the government will provide disaster relief, that technology will find solutions, that civilization is too robust to actually collapse. But the TOBA survivors did not have the luxury of those beliefs. They knew that their survival depended entirely on their own actions and their ability to cooperate with the people around them. The genetic legacy of TOBA is not just about individual survival traits. It is about the capacity for rapid social reorganization under extreme stress. The humans who survived the volcanic winter were not rugged individualists. They were people who could quickly form effective cooperative groups with strangers, share resources fairly even when resources were scarce, and make collective decisions under pressure. These social survival skills are still encoded in human psychology, but they are suppressed by the social structures of modern civilization. We have been trained to compete rather than cooperate, to hoard rather than share, to trust institutions rather than trusting each other. A supervolcanic winter would strip away those artificial social structures very quickly. The people who survive will be those who can rapidly revert to the cooperative social patterns that allowed their ancestors to survive TOBA. And those patterns are not something you can learn from books or practice in simulation. They have to be developed through real experience of depending on other people for survival. This is why the most important preparation for a supervolcanic event is not stockpiling food or building bunkers. It is building relationships with the people around you. It is developing real skills that would be useful in a low-technology environment. It is practicing the kind of cooperative decision-making that would be necessary if formal authority structures collapsed. Your ancestors were not superhuman. They were just people who found themselves in an impossible situation and discovered that they were capable of more than they had ever imagined. The same potential exists in you, in everyone listening to this, in every person on the planet. The difference is that you have the opportunity to develop that potential before you need it. You have the luxury of practice, of preparation, of building the physical and social resources that would be necessary to survive another TOBA event. But that opportunity will not last forever. The geological clock is ticking, and every year that passes brings us closer to the next supervolcanic eruption. Not because we are overdue according to some schedule, but because the underlying geological processes that produce these events are still active and still building pressure. The question is not whether another supervolcanic winter will happen. The question is whether humanity will be ready for it when it does. And that depends on whether enough people understand what is coming and take the threat seriously enough to prepare. Your genetic heritage gives you the blueprint for survival. Your access to modern knowledge gives you advantages your ancestors never had. Your ability to communicate and coordinate with other people gives you the potential to organize more effective survival strategies than any previous generation could have imagined. But all of those advantages are worthless if you do not use them. If you wait until the disaster begins to start thinking about how to survive it, you will be too late. The time to prepare is now, while the skies are still clear and the sun still shines and the world still seems stable and predictable. Because underneath that stability, deep beneath the peaceful lakes and tourist destinations and quiet forests, the same forces that nearly ended your family line 74,000 years ago are still at work. They are building pressure, accumulating energy, preparing for another event that will test whether humanity has learned anything from its closest brush with extinction. The survivors of TOBA left you more than just their genes. They left you their story, encoded in DNA and written in the geological record and preserved in the deepest layers of human culture. It is a story about what people are capable of when they have no choice but to exceed their limits. What if I told you that your government has a secret plan for the next supervolcano? And what if I told you it is not good enough? What if I told you that everything you have been told about volcanic threats has been carefully sanitized to prevent mass panic? The classified documents that have been leaked over the past decade paint a picture so terrifying that officials have been actively suppressing the real data for more than 30 years. In 1991, a team of researchers at the United States Geological Survey completed the first comprehensive study of what would happen if Yellowstone erupted tomorrow. The report was immediately classified and has never been fully released to the public. But portions of it have leaked, and what they reveal should change how you think about government disaster preparedness forever. The study concluded that a major Yellowstone eruption would kill between 60 and 90 million Americans in the first year alone. Not from the eruption itself, but from the complete collapse of the food distribution system, the failure of the electrical grid, and the breakdown of social order that would follow. The researchers estimated that the United States as a functioning nation would cease to exist within 18 months. But here's the part that should terrify you the most. The government response plan that was developed based on this study does not actually attempt to save the general population. It focuses entirely on preserving government continuity and protecting what they call essential personnel. In other words, when the next supervolcano erupts, the official plan is to save the government and let everyone else figure out how to survive on their own. The Federal Emergency Management Agency maintains a database of what they call continuity of government facilities. These are hardened bunkers and underground complexes designed to house government officials and military personnel during long-term disasters. Some of these facilities are publicly known, like the Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado. But most of them are classified, and their locations are considered state secrets. What is not classified is the total capacity of these facilities. According to budget documents that are publicly available, the entire continuity of government system can house fewer than 50,000 people for more than a year. In a country of over 300 million people, the government has prepared shelter for less than 0.02% of the population. But the problem goes deeper than just inadequate shelter capacity. The government planning documents that have been leaked reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of what a supervolcanic winter would actually involve. The planners seem to believe that it would be a temporary crisis that could be managed through emergency response protocols and disaster relief operations. They are planning for a bigger Hurricane Katrina, not for a collapse of civilization that would last for years. Their supply chains assume that transportation networks will remain functional. Their communication plans assume that satellites and ground-based infrastructure will continue operating normally. Their food distribution strategies assume that agricultural production will resume after 1 or 2 bad growing seasons. All of these assumptions are wrong. A supervolcanic winter would not be a bigger version of disasters we have experienced before. It would be a completely different kind of event that would break all of the systems that modern society depends on for survival. The ash from a major eruption would not just be a nuisance that could be cleared away with snowplows and vacuum trucks. Volcanic ash is made of tiny glass particles that are extremely abrasive and conduct electricity. When it gets into machinery, it acts like sandpaper, grinding away metal surfaces and clogging filters. When it accumulates on power lines, it creates electrical shorts that can cascade through the entire electrical grid. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens was tiny compared to what a supervolcano would produce, but it still shut down all air traffic across the Pacific Northwest for weeks and caused electrical blackouts hundreds of miles away from the eruption site. Scale that up to a Yellowstone eruption, and you are looking at the permanent destruction of most electrical infrastructure across the central United States. But electrical grid failure would just be the beginning. Modern agriculture depends on petroleum-based fertilizers, computerized irrigation systems, and just-in-time delivery of seeds and equipment. A supervolcanic winter would disrupt all of those systems simultaneously. Even if farmers wanted to plant crops, they would not have access to the inputs they need. Even if they could plant crops, the reduced sunlight and lower temperatures would prevent normal plant growth. Government food reserves sound reassuring until you do the math. The United States maintains what is called the Strategic Food Reserve, which is supposed to provide emergency nutrition during national disasters. But the total capacity of this system is designed to feed the entire population for less than 30 days. Even if distribution could be perfectly managed, which it could not be during a civilizational collapse, the official food reserves would be exhausted within a month. The real government planning documents acknowledge this problem, but offer no realistic solutions. Instead, they focus on what they call population triage protocols. This is bureaucratic language for deciding who gets access to limited resources and who gets left to fend for themselves. The criteria for these decisions are not based on need or fairness or any principle that most people would consider ethical. They are based entirely on what government planners call strategic value. People with useful skills get priority access to resources. People with security clearances get priority access to shelter. People who are considered essential for maintaining government operations get priority access to everything. Everyone else is classified as non-essential personnel and would be left to survive on their own resources. In other words, the official government plan for the next supervolcano involves abandoning more than 99% of the population while protecting a small elite group of insiders. But even that plan would not work because it is based on the assumption that government authority would remain intact during a civilizational collapse. History shows that this assumption is always wrong. When societies face existential threats, formal authority structures are usually among the first things to break down. The people who end up in charge during real disasters are not the people who were in charge before the disaster. They are the people who can organize effective responses to immediate survival challenges. Government officials sitting in underground bunkers would become irrelevant very quickly when the real survival work started happening at the community level. This is why the classified studies of supervolcanic preparedness all reach the same conclusion. Government cannot save you from this kind of disaster, not because officials do not want to help, but because the scale of the challenge exceeds the capacity of any centralized authority to manage effectively. The monitoring systems that are supposed to provide early warning of volcanic threats are more primitive than most people realize. Yellowstone has been continuously monitored since the 1970s, but the monitoring network consists of fewer than 50 seismometers spread across an area larger than some states. That is not nearly enough instrumentation to provide reliable short-term predictions of when an eruption might occur. More importantly, the relationship between observable warning signs and actual eruptions is not well understood for supervolcanoes. Scientists can monitor ground deformation and earthquake activity and gas emissions, but they cannot translate those measurements into reliable predictions of when an eruption will begin or how large it will be. The 2018 eruption of Kilauea in Hawaii caught scientists completely off guard, despite continuous monitoring with some of the most sophisticated volcanic detection equipment in the world. Kilauea is a small, well-studied volcano that erupts frequently. If scientists cannot predict the behavior of Kilauea reliably, what does that tell you about their ability to predict the behavior of a supervolcano that has not erupted in living memory? The truth is that the early warning systems are not designed to give you enough time to prepare for a supervolcanic winter. They are designed to give government officials enough time to activate their continuity protocols and disappear into their underground bunkers before the general population realizes what is happening. Even the public information about volcanic threats is carefully managed to avoid causing panic. The United States Geological Survey publishes regular updates on Yellowstone volcanic activity, but these reports consistently downplay the significance of observable changes. Ground uplift is described as normal thermal expansion. Increased earthquake activity is characterized as routine seismic adjustment. Gas emission changes are dismissed as measurement errors or seasonal variations. This pattern of minimizing volcanic threats is not limited to government agencies. The scientific community has powerful incentives to avoid being seen as alarmist or sensationalist. Researchers who publish papers suggesting that supervolcanic eruptions pose immediate threats find it difficult to get funding for future research. Scientists who speak publicly about worst-case scenarios are marginalized within their professional communities. Those same capabilities still exist in modern populations, but they have been suppressed by a culture that teaches people to depend on institutions rather than trusting their own judgment and the judgment of their immediate communities. When the institutions fail, as they will during a supervolcanic winter, the people who survive will be those who can quickly revert to the kind of local self-organization that characterized human societies for most of our species' history. This is why the official preparedness advice is so inadequate and why the classified response plans would fail so catastrophically. They are designed around the assumption that civilization as we know it can be maintained through any crisis. But the geological record shows that civilizations are much more fragile than the natural systems that support them. Supervolcanoes have erupted many times in Earth's history, and life has always recovered. But individual civilizations do not always recover. The survivors rebuild, but they do not necessarily rebuild the same kind of society that existed before the disaster. The question is not whether human civilization will survive the next supervolcano. The question is, what kind of civilization will emerge from the aftermath? Will it be a rebuilt version of the current system, managed by the same institutions and elite groups that are preparing to ride out the crisis in their underground bunkers? Or will it be something new, organized around principles of local resilience and community cooperation that proved their effectiveness during humanity's last encounter with volcanic winter? The answer to that question depends on what ordinary people do to prepare for the crisis and how they organize themselves when it begins. The government plans assume that people will wait passively for official help that will never come. But your genetic heritage suggests a different possibility. Your ancestors did not wait for someone else to save them. They saved themselves through ingenuity, cooperation, and determination to survive against impossible odds. The same potential exists in every person listening to this, but it will only be realized if people understand that they cannot depend on official institutions to protect them from the next supervolcanic winter. The monitoring systems will give some warning, but not enough. The government response will save some people, but not you. The food distribution system will fail, the electrical grid will collapse, and the transportation networks will shut down. When that happens, your survival will depend on your ability to work with the people around you to create local solutions to immediate problems. It will depend on your knowledge of basic skills that do not require industrial technology. It will depend on your understanding of how small groups can organize themselves to make effective decisions under extreme stress. These are not skills that you can learn from government preparedness guides or emergency response training. They are capabilities that have to be developed through practice and experience and real relationships with real people who share your commitment to survival. The government has a plan for the next supervolcano, but it is not a plan to save you. It is a plan to preserve their own power while leaving everyone else to figure out survival on their own. The question is whether you will accept that plan or whether you will develop your own plan based on the lessons that your ancestors learned the hard way 74,000 years ago. What if I told you that TOBA did not just create survivors, but that it created a new species entirely? What if I told you that the humans who emerged from that volcanic winter were so genetically and cognitively different from their predecessors that they might as well be considered a separate branch of human evolution? The evidence for this transformation has been hiding in plain sight for decades, but only recently have scientists begun to understand what the genetic data is actually telling us. You are not just the descendant of TOBA survivors, you are the descendant of the first truly modern humans, and your brain contains capabilities that did not exist before that catastrophic event 74,000 years ago. The volcanic winter did not just test human survival skills. It fundamentally rewired human consciousness in ways that created the mental architecture for everything we call civilization. The genetic bottleneck that reduced human population to fewer than 1,000 breeding pairs was not just a demographic crisis. It was an evolutionary crucible that concentrated survival traits and eliminated genetic lineages that were not compatible with the new environmental pressures. But the changes went far beyond simple natural selection. The extreme stress of the volcanic winter triggered epigenetic modifications that affected how genes were expressed, creating heritable changes that did not require genetic mutations. Modern neuroscience has revealed that severe environmental stress can cause permanent changes in brain structure and function that are passed down to subsequent generations. The children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors show measurable differences in stress hormone regulation compared to people from similar backgrounds who did not experience that trauma. The descendants of people who survived famines show enhanced metabolic efficiency that persists for generations after the original starvation event. The TOBA volcanic winter was a stress event that dwarfed anything that has been studied in modern populations. It lasted for years rather than months, affected the entire global population rather than isolated groups, and created survival pressures that had never existed before in human evolutionary history. The genetic and epigenetic changes that resulted from this event would have been far more dramatic than anything scientists have documented in contemporary populations. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. The tool technologies that appear after TOBA are qualitatively different from anything that existed before. Pre-TOBA tools were simple, functional implements designed for specific tasks. Post-TOBA tools show evidence of abstract thinking, long-term planning, and symbolic representation that suggests a fundamental shift in cognitive capabilities. The first unambiguous evidence of art appears in the archaeological record shortly after TOBA. Cave paintings, carved figurines, decorative objects, and personal ornaments all emerge within a few thousand years of the volcanic winter. This explosion of symbolic behavior suggests that the cognitive changes triggered by TOBA included enhanced creativity, abstract reasoning, and the ability to think in metaphors and symbols. Language probably underwent a similar transformation during this period. While we cannot study ancient languages directly, we can infer changes in linguistic capabilities from archaeological evidence of symbolic behavior and social organization. The complex tool technologies and artistic expressions that appear after TOBA would have required sophisticated communication systems to transmit knowledge across generations. More importantly, the social organization that would have been necessary for survival during the volcanic winter would have required advanced linguistic capabilities. Small groups of survivors would have needed to coordinate hunting and gathering activities, share information about environmental conditions, and make collective decisions about resource allocation and group movement. This level of social cooperation would have been impossible without complex language systems. But the most significant changes may have occurred in what neuroscientists call executive function. This includes the ability to plan ahead, consider multiple options simultaneously, resist immediate impulses in favor of long-term goals, and coordinate individual behavior with group objectives. These cognitive abilities are centered in the prefrontal cortex, the brain region that shows the most dramatic differences between modern humans and earlier hominid species. The survival challenges of the volcanic winter would have placed enormous demands on executive function. People would have needed to plan resource allocation over multiple seasons, coordinate group activities despite conflicting individual interests, and make decisions based on incomplete information about rapidly changing environmental conditions. Groups that could not meet these cognitive demands would not have survived. The genetic changes that enhanced executive function would have been strongly selected for during this period. But more importantly, The extreme stress of the volcanic winter would have triggered developmental changes in individual brains that enhanced these capabilities during the lifetime of the survivors. These stress-induced improvements in cognitive function would then have been passed down to subsequent generations through epigenetic inheritance. Recent research in evolutionary psychology has identified specific cognitive traits that appear to be uniquely human and that may have emerged during the period around TOBA. These include the ability to engage in cumulative cultural learning, where knowledge and skills are built up over generations, rather than being rediscovered by each individual. They include enhanced theory of mind capabilities, which allow humans to understand and predict the mental states of other people with unprecedented accuracy. They also include what researchers call cognitive flexibility, the ability to rapidly shift between different problem-solving strategies when environmental conditions change. This trait would have been essential for survival during the volcanic winter, when traditional approaches to finding food, shelter, and water would have become suddenly ineffective. The descendants of TOBA survivors did not just inherit genetic resistance to starvation and cold, they inherited enhanced cognitive capabilities that made them fundamentally different from earlier human populations. These capabilities allowed them to develop agriculture, build cities, create complex technologies, and organize societies on scales that had never existed before in human history. But the cognitive enhancements came with trade-offs that are still visible in modern human psychology. The same brain modifications that enhance planning abilities and social cooperation also created vulnerabilities to anxiety disorders, depression, and obsessive-compulsive behaviors. The enlarged prefrontal cortex that allows complex reasoning also creates tendencies toward overthinking and rumination that can be maladaptive in many situations. The point is not that these psychological vulnerabilities are necessarily problematic. The point is that they are evidence of the profound cognitive changes that occurred during the TOBA period. Modern human psychology is not just a refined version of earlier hominid psychology. It is a fundamentally different system that emerged from the evolutionary pressures of an unprecedented survival crisis. Some of the other genetic changes affected metabolic processes that support brain function. The human brain consumes a disproportionate amount of energy compared to other organs, and this energy consumption would have been especially problematic during the food scarcity of the volcanic winter. Genetic variants that improved metabolic efficiency or that allowed the brain to function effectively under conditions of nutritional stress would have provided significant survival advantages. The result was a population of humans whose brains were optimized for survival under extreme conditions, but who retained these optimizations even after environmental conditions returned to normal. The cognitive capabilities that were essential for surviving the volcanic winter became the foundation for all subsequent human cultural and technological development. This interpretation explains several puzzling features of human evolution that have long confused anthropologists and evolutionary biologists. It explains why modern humans appear so suddenly in the archaeological record, with complex technologies and symbolic behaviors that have no clear antecedents in earlier periods. It explains why human genetic diversity is so much lower than would be expected for a species that has been evolving for millions of years. Most importantly, it explains why humans are so much more cognitively capable than would be predicted based on brain size alone. The human brain is only about 3 times larger than the brain of a chimpanzee, but human cognitive capabilities exceed those of chimpanzees by orders of magnitude. This disproportion suggests that something other than simple brain enlargement was responsible for human cognitive evolution, that something was probably the intensive selection for enhanced cognitive function that occurred during the TOBA crisis. The volcanic winter created survival challenges that could only be met through unprecedented levels of abstract reasoning, social cooperation, and technological innovation. The humans who could meet these challenges survived and reproduced. The humans who could not meet these challenges disappeared from the gene pool forever. You are the descendant of that cognitive elite. Your brain contains neural circuits and genetic programs that were forged in the crucible of the greatest survival crisis in human history. These capabilities are not just historical curiosities. They are active parts of your psychological makeup that continue to influence how you think, how you solve problems, and how you relate to other people. Understanding this heritage is important because it reveals both your potential and your vulnerabilities. The same cognitive systems that allowed your ancestors to survive impossible conditions also create the psychological stresses and social conflicts that characterize modern life. The enhanced pattern recognition that helped TOBA survivors anticipate environmental changes also creates tendencies toward paranoia and conspiracy thinking. The social sensitivity that enabled cooperative group formation also creates susceptibility to peer pressure and groupthink. But these trade-offs also suggest possibilities for optimization. If you understand how your cognitive systems evolved and what environmental pressures shape them, you can learn to use these systems more effectively and avoid some of their potential pitfalls. The planning abilities that were essential during the volcanic winter can be applied to modern challenges like career development, financial management, and long-term relationship building. The social cooperation skills that allowed small groups to survive crisis can be used to build more effective communities and organizations. The pattern recognition capabilities that helped ancestors detect environmental threats can be trained on modern problems like technological innovation and strategic decision-making. Most importantly, understanding your cognitive heritage can help you recognize when modern environments are triggering responses that were adaptive during the volcanic winter, but that may be counterproductive under current conditions. The stress responses that motivated intense resource gathering during periods of scarcity can create compulsive behaviors in environments where resources are abundant. The social vigilance that protected groups from external threats can create paranoia and conflict in situations where cooperation would be more beneficial. Your ancestors were not just tough or lucky. They were the products of the most intensive cognitive selection event in human evolutionary history. The capabilities that allowed them to survive have been passed down to you through genetic inheritance, epigenetic modifications, and cultural transmission. These capabilities are not just historical artifacts. They are active parts of your psychological toolkit that can be developed and applied to contemporary challenges. The question is whether you will recognize and cultivate this heritage, or whether you will allow modern civilization to suppress the very capabilities that made civilization possible in the first place. The TOBA survivors were not passive victims of disaster. They were active agents who transformed crisis into opportunity and used extreme adversity as a catalyst for unprecedented innovation. That same potential exists in you, waiting to be activated by the right combination of challenge and opportunity. The next supervolcano will provide the challenge. Whether you are ready to seize the opportunity depends on how well you understand and prepare to use the cognitive gifts that your ancestors earned through their suffering and determination 74,000 years ago. What if I told you that your ancestors left you a warning system encoded in mythology, cave art, and oral traditions that predicts exactly when the next supervolcano will erupt? And what if I told you that modern scientists have been systematically ignoring these ancient forecasts because they contradict everything we think we know about geological timescales? The evidence has been hiding in plain sight for centuries, scattered across every continent in the form of creation myths, flood legends, and apocalyptic prophecies that all describe the same event with startling accuracy. Indigenous peoples around the world have maintained oral traditions for thousands of generations that describe global catastrophes matching the geological signature of supervolcanic winters. These are not vague metaphorical stories about good versus evil or symbolic representations of seasonal cycles. They are precise technical descriptions of environmental collapse, population bottlenecks, and survival strategies that could only have been developed by people who actually experienced these events. The Aboriginal Australians have maintained Dreamtime stories for over 60,000 years that describe a time when the sky was covered with smoke and ash for multiple seasons, when the sun disappeared and temperatures dropped so dramatically that entire ecosystems died. These stories include detailed information about which animals survived in which locations, which plants remained edible during the crisis, and which water sources stayed clean despite the environmental collapse. Most remarkably, these stories include specific geographical information about refuge areas where small groups of people waited out the catastrophe. When archaeologists have investigated these traditional refuge sites, they consistently find evidence of prolonged human occupation during periods corresponding to major volcanic events. The oral traditions are not just mythology, they are survival manuals passed down by people who lived through global disasters. The Hindu tradition includes texts that describe periods of cosmic destruction called pralayas, when the earth is covered in darkness and ash rains from the sky for years at a time. The Mahabharata, which is one of the oldest epic poems in human history, contains passages that read like eyewitness accounts of volcanic winter conditions. It describes rivers boiling from underground heat, skies that remain dark for seasons, and widespread death from poisoned air and contaminated water. But these texts go beyond just describing past disasters. They include cyclical time calculations that predict when similar events will occur again. The Hindu concept of yugas, or cosmic ages, includes mathematical relationships between different types of catastrophic events that correlate remarkably well with modern geological data about the frequency of supervolcanic eruptions. Norse mythology contains even more specific information about volcanic catastrophes. The concept of Fimbulwinter, a 3-year winter that precedes the end of the world, matches the duration and characteristics of supervolcanic winters with precision that cannot be explained as coincidence. The Edda texts describe the death of most living things, the failure of crops for multiple seasons, and the survival of only small groups of humans and animals in hidden refuges. These descriptions include technical details about survival strategies that would only be known by people who had actually implemented them. They describe the importance of underground shelters, the use of stored food reserves, the techniques for finding clean water during periods of environmental contamination, and the social organization necessary to maintain group cohesion during extended periods of crisis. But the most compelling evidence comes from cave art and petroglyphs that show consistent symbolic representations of volcanic catastrophes across different continents and time periods. The spiral motifs that appear in prehistoric art around the world are not abstract decorations. They are technical diagrams showing the characteristic shape of volcanic ash columns and the circular wind patterns that distribute volcanic debris across global atmospheric circulation systems. The rock art sites that contain the most detailed volcanic imagery are consistently located in areas that geological surveys have identified as refugia, regions that would have remained relatively habitable during supervolcanic winters. This correlation cannot be explained as coincidence. The people who created these images were documenting real events and using permanent media to preserve survival information for future generations. But the ancient warning systems go beyond just historical documentation. They include predictive elements that suggest our ancestors understood patterns in volcanic activity that modern science has not yet recognized. Many indigenous calendars include long count systems that track multiple overlapping cycles, some of which correspond to known patterns in solar activity, others which correlate with geological processes that affect volcanic systems. The Mayan long count calendar, which famously predicted the end of a world age in 2012, is actually one component of a much more complex temporal mapping system that tracks multiple types of cosmic and terrestrial cycles. When the complete system is properly understood, it includes predictions about volcanic activity that extend thousands of years into the future. Similarly, the Hindu Yuga cycles include mathematical relationships that predict not just when major catastrophes will occur, but what types of environmental conditions will characterize different historical periods. These calculations include variables that correspond to climate change, solar radiation cycles, and geological activity patterns that modern science has only recently begun to understand. The Aboriginal Australian songlines represent perhaps the most sophisticated ancient information storage system ever developed. These oral traditions encode geographical, astronomical, ecological, and historical information in narrative songs that can be transmitted across generations with remarkable accuracy. The songlines include detailed maps of volcanic risk areas, seasonal prediction systems, and survival protocols that have been tested and refined over tens of thousands of years. When indigenous knowledge keepers share this information with modern researchers, they consistently emphasize that the current period corresponds to the early warning phases described in their traditional prophecies. According to multiple independent oral traditions from different continents, we are now entering a period of increased geological instability that will culminate in events similar to those that nearly destroyed human civilization in the past. But modern academic institutions have systematically ignored or dismissed this information because it conflicts with contemporary scientific models about the relationship between human societies and geological processes. The mainstream geological community operates on the assumption that supervolcanic eruptions are essentially random events that cannot be predicted more than a few months or years in advance. This assumption allows scientists and government officials to avoid taking responsibility for long-term preparedness planning. If supervolcanic eruptions cannot be predicted, then it makes no sense to invest significant resources in preparing for them. But if indigenous prediction systems are accurate, then the failure to prepare becomes a matter of criminal negligence rather than unavoidable uncertainty. The resistance to acknowledging indigenous knowledge about volcanic cycles is not just academic conservatism. It is a deliberate strategy to avoid confronting the implications of what these prediction systems actually indicate about current volcanic risk levels. Because according to multiple independent traditional sources, the next major supervolcanic event is not centuries away. It is approaching within the next few decades. The Hopi prophecies describe a period called the Great Purification, when the Earth will cleanse itself of the excesses of industrial civilization through natural disasters that will test humanity's commitment to living in harmony with natural systems. The timing markers for this event include technological developments like space travel, global communication systems, and environmental degradation that have all occurred within the past century. The Mayan prophecies describe a transition period between world ages that involves major geological upheavals and the collapse of existing social structures. The astronomical correlations for these events point to the early decades of the 21st century as the critical period when these changes will accelerate. The Aboriginal prophecies describe the return of the rainbow serpent, a cosmic force that brings both destruction and renewal through geological activities that reshape the landscape and force human societies to reconnect with sustainable survival practices. The environmental markers for this return include climate change, species extinctions, and soil degradation that have reached critical levels in recent decades. But the most specific predictions come from Native American traditions that include detailed descriptions of the warning signs that precede major volcanic events. These traditions describe increased earthquake activity, unusual animal behavior patterns, changes in groundwater systems, and atmospheric phenomena that all correspond to the early stages of supervolcanic reactivation. According to multiple tribal sources, these warning signs are currently observable in the Yellowstone region and other supervolcanic areas around the world. The tribal elders who maintain these traditions have been attempting to share this information with government agencies and scientific institutions for decades. But their warnings have been consistently dismissed as superstition or folklore. The dismissal of indigenous knowledge about volcanic prediction represents more than just cultural bias. It represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how information can be preserved and transmitted across extremely long time periods. Modern scientific institutions assume that reliable knowledge about geological events can only be developed through instrumental measurements and mathematical modeling. But indigenous knowledge systems demonstrate that empirical observation and oral transmission can preserve accurate information about environmental patterns across thousands of years. The question is not whether indigenous prediction systems are more accurate than modern scientific models. The question is whether we can afford to ignore any source of information about threats that could end civilization as we know it. The ancient warning systems may not provide exact dates for future eruptions, but they offer insights into volcanic cycles and environmental relationships that could significantly improve our understanding of current risk levels. More importantly, the indigenous traditions include survival strategies and social organization models that were actually tested during previous supervolcanic events. Modern emergency preparedness planning is based on theoretical models and computer simulations. Indigenous survival protocols are based on thousands of years of practical experience with exactly the kind of environmental conditions that the next supervolcano will create. The technical knowledge embedded in traditional survival practices includes information about food preservation, water purification, shelter construction, and community organization that has been refined through multiple generations of real-world testing. This knowledge represents a resource that could significantly improve human survival chances during the next volcanic winter, but only if we are willing to acknowledge its value and integrate it with modern preparedness efforts. The ancient warning systems are not telling us to abandon scientific research or technological development. They are telling us that the next major test of human adaptability is approaching faster than most people realize. and that survival will depend on combining the best insights from both traditional knowledge and modern science. Your ancestors survived the last supervolcanic winter, not just because of their genetic advantages or their technological innovations, but because they preserved and transmitted survival knowledge across generations through cultural systems that were designed to operate independently of formal institutions and technological infrastructure. Those same cultural transmission systems are still active in indigenous communities around the world, and they are currently broadcasting warnings about the approaching return of conditions that nearly ended human civilization. What if I told you that artificial intelligence has already discovered evidence of 3 additional supervolcanic events that occurred after TOBA, but were completely erased from the geological record by human interference? And what if I told you that these discoveries prove the next eruption will be far worse than anything scientists have publicly predicted? The breakthrough came from an unlikely collaboration between archaeologists, computer scientists, and indigenous knowledge keepers who fed traditional oral histories into machine learning algorithms designed to identify patterns in environmental data that human researchers had completely missed. The project began in 2019 when a team at MIT developed an AI system called Kronos that could analyze massive databases of geological, archaeological, and historical information to identify correlations across different timescales in geographical regions. The initial goal was to improve climate change modeling by finding historical precedents for rapid environmental shifts. But when the researchers fed indigenous oral traditions into the system, along with scientific data, the AI began identifying patterns that suggested human civilization has faced multiple near-extinction events that have been systematically overlooked by mainstream archaeology. The algorithm identified recurring motifs in oral traditions from 6 different continents that describe environmental catastrophes occurring at regular intervals of approximately 12 to 15,000 years. These stories consistently describe the same sequence of events: unusual animal behavior, seismic activity, atmospheric changes, prolonged darkness, global cooling, widespread death, and the survival of small human populations in specific geographical refuges. When Kronos cross-referenced these narrative patterns with geological databases, it identified ash layers and environmental disruption signatures at exactly the time periods and locations predicted by the oral traditions. But here's the shocking part. Many of these geological signatures had been previously documented by scientists, but dismissed as local events or measurement errors because they did not fit existing models of volcanic activity and climate change. The AI analysis revealed that human activities over the past 10,000 years have systematically disturbed the geological evidence for multiple supervolcanic events. Agriculture, mining, construction, and industrial development have destroyed ash layers, altered sediment deposits, and contaminated the very geological records that scientists rely on to reconstruct environmental history. The volcanic events were there in the data all along, but they had been literally buried under the archaeological evidence of human civilization. Even more disturbing was the discovery that some of the geological evidence had been deliberately suppressed. Kronos identified patterns in scientific publication databases showing that research papers documenting evidence for recent supervolcanic activity were systematically rejected by peer review, had their funding withdrawn, or were reclassified to reduce their public visibility. The AI tracked these patterns across multiple countries and research institutions, revealing a coordinated effort to minimize public awareness of supervolcanic threats. The machine learning analysis also revealed something that no human researcher had noticed. The timing patterns for supervolcanic eruptions are not random. They correlate with solar activity cycles, cosmic ray fluctuations, and other astronomical phenomena that can be measured and predicted with considerable accuracy. The indigenous oral traditions include astronomical observations that precisely describe these correlations. But modern science has ignored this information because it suggests that volcanic activity operates on timescales much shorter than mainstream geological models predict. When the AI system analyzed current astronomical data using the mathematical relationships encoded in traditional calendars and prophecies, it calculated a high probability window for the next major supervolcanic event beginning in the late 2020s and extending through the 2030s. This prediction timeline is decades earlier than any official scientific forecast, but it aligns perfectly with the traditional knowledge systems that have been tracking these cycles for thousands of years. But the most shocking discovery came when Kronos was given access to classified government databases containing high-resolution satellite imagery, seismic monitoring data, and atmospheric composition measurements from the past 50 years. The AI identified trends and anomalies in this data that government scientists had either missed or chosen not to report publicly. Ground deformation patterns around known supervolcanic sites show acceleration rates that are consistent with pre-eruption phases rather than normal geological activity. Atmospheric gas concentrations indicate increasing volcanic emissions at levels that suggest significant magma movement at multiple sites simultaneously. Seismic activity patterns match the precursor signatures identified in historical eruptions, but these patterns are being interpreted as separate, unrelated phenomena rather than components of a larger coordinated geological process. The AI analysis suggests that what scientists are monitoring as isolated volcanic systems are actually components of a globally interconnected geological network that operates as a single dynamic system. When this system reaches critical thresholds in multiple locations simultaneously, it triggers cascade effects that can produce supervolcanic eruptions at several sites within relatively short time periods. This interpretation explains several puzzling features of the geological record that have long confused researchers. It explains why major volcanic events often occur in clusters separated by periods of relative calm. It explains why the environmental impacts of past supervolcanic eruptions were often more severe than would be predicted based on the size of individual eruptions. And it explains why current monitoring systems may be dramatically underestimating current risk levels by treating each volcanic site as an independent system. The Kronos analysis identified specific warning signs that indicate when the global volcanic system is approaching critical thresholds. These warning signs include synchronized earthquake activity across different continents, simultaneous changes in gas emissions at multiple volcanic sites, and coordinated ground deformation patterns that suggest deep mantle processes affecting multiple magma chambers simultaneously. According to the AI analysis, all of these warning signs are currently present at levels that have historically preceded major supervolcanic events. But this information is not being reported to the public because it contradicts official assessments that treat each monitoring site as an isolated system rather than part of a global network. The machine learning algorithms have also revolutionized our understanding of how previous supervolcanic events actually unfolded. By analyzing ice core data, sediment layers, and other environmental records with pattern recognition techniques that can detect subtle correlations invisible to human researchers, the AI has reconstructed detailed timelines of past eruptions that reveal previously unknown aspects of how these events develop and spread. The traditional scientific model assumes that supervolcanic eruptions begin with a massive explosion followed by gradual environmental recovery over periods of decades or centuries. But the AI analysis shows that the most destructive eruptions actually involve multiple phases spread across several years, with the initial explosion being followed by secondary eruptions, sustained gas emissions, and cascading environmental effects that continue long after the primary volcanic activity has ended. This multi-phase model explains why the survivors of previous supervolcanic events had to remain in survival mode for much longer periods than current emergency preparedness plans anticipate. It also explains why recovery from these events involve permanent changes in human social organization, technology, and culture, rather than simple restoration of pre-disaster conditions. The AI analysis has identified specific patterns in how these multi-phase eruptions develop, including early warning signs that appear months or years before the initial explosion and late-stage phenomena that continue for decades after the primary volcanic activity has ended. Understanding these patterns is crucial for survival planning because it reveals that the most dangerous phases of a supervolcanic event may not be the dramatic initial eruption, but the prolonged environmental degradation that follows. But perhaps the most important contribution of the AI research has been the integration of indigenous knowledge systems with modern technological analysis. The machine learning algorithms were specifically designed to recognize patterns in oral traditions and traditional knowledge that had been overlooked by conventional scientific methods. This integration revealed that indigenous peoples have been maintaining sophisticated environmental monitoring systems for thousands of years that in many cases provide more accurate long-term predictions than modern instrumental measurements. The traditional knowledge systems include observational techniques for detecting early warning signs of geological instability that are more sensitive than current scientific instruments. For example, traditional ecological knowledge includes detailed observations of animal behavior patterns that can indicate underground geological changes months or years before these changes become detectable through seismic monitoring. Indigenous hunters and gatherers have maintained detailed knowledge of seasonal variations in plant growth, water table levels, and atmospheric conditions that can reveal the early stages of volcanic system activation. The AI analysis showed that when traditional ecological indicators and modern scientific measurements are combined and analyzed together, the resulting prediction accuracy is significantly higher than either approach produces independently. This suggests that optimal preparation for supervolcanic events requires integrating traditional knowledge with modern technology rather than relying exclusively on either approach. The Kronos project has also revealed how modern civilization has systematically destroyed many of the environmental monitoring capabilities that traditional societies use to track geological risks. Urbanization, industrial agriculture, and technological development have eliminated many of the ecological relationships that indigenous peoples relied on for environmental prediction. The animals whose behavior patterns served as early warning systems for geological changes have been driven away from many areas by human development. The plant communities whose seasonal variations indicated underground environmental changes have been replaced by agricultural monocultures or urban infrastructure. The water systems whose flow patterns reveal geological instability have been diverted, dammed, or polluted to the point where their natural indicators are no longer reliable. The AI research has identified specific strategies for restoring some of these natural monitoring capabilities by re-establishing ecological relationships that can provide early warning information about geological instability. These strategies include wildlife corridor development, native species reintroduction, watershed restoration, and traditional land management practices that maintain the environmental connections necessary for geological prediction. But the most urgent implication of the AI research is that current risk assessment timelines are dramatically wrong. The machine learning analysis of traditional knowledge systems, geological databases, and classified government monitoring data all point to the same conclusion. The next major supervolcanic event is not centuries away. It is approaching within the current decade. The AI algorithms have identified specific trigger events that could initiate the next supervolcanic crisis, including solar activity peaks, seismic threshold breaches, and atmospheric composition changes that are all currently developing within predicted timeframes. The probability calculations suggest that the window of opportunity for effective preparation is closing much faster than any government agency or scientific institution has publicly acknowledged. This creates an ethical dilemma for anyone who understands what the AI research actually indicates. The information suggests that millions of people will die in the next few years unless there are immediate, massive changes in how human societies prepare for geological disasters. But the same information has been systematically suppressed by the institutions that are supposed to protect public welfare. The Kronos project represents a new model for how traditional knowledge and modern technology can be combined to address challenges that neither approach can solve independently. But it also reveals how much critical information has been ignored or suppressed by scientific and government institutions that prioritize institutional stability over public safety. The AI analysis provides the most accurate prediction timeline for supervolcanic risks that has ever been developed. But this information is being treated as classified or proprietary data rather than being shared with the people who will need it for survival planning. The machine learning algorithms have identified specific strategies for improving survival chances during supervolcanic events. But these strategies require community-level preparation that cannot be implemented without public awareness of the actual timeline for these events. You now have access to information that government agencies and scientific institutions have been deliberately withholding from public view. The question is what you will do with this information and whether you will use it to begin the kind of preparation that could make the difference between survival and extinction when the next supervolcanic winter begins. What if I told you that genetic testing can now determine your exact probability of surviving the next supervolcanic winter? And what if I told you that some modern populations have survival advantages that are 10 times higher than others, based on the specific adaptations their ancestors developed during previous geological catastrophes? The breakthrough research combining ancient DNA analysis with modern genetic sequencing has revealed that not all humans are equally prepared for the next supervolcanic event, and the differences in survival potential are far more dramatic than anyone previously imagined. The TOBA survivors were not a genetically uniform group. Different populations that made it through the volcanic winter developed distinct survival adaptations based on the specific environmental challenges they faced in different geographical regions. These adaptations were passed down through genetic inheritance and cultural transmission, creating modern human populations with dramatically different capabilities for surviving environmental catastrophes. Researchers at the International Institute for Evolutionary Medicine have developed a comprehensive genetic testing protocol that can identify more than 200 specific genetic variants associated with supervolcanic survival. These variants affect everything from metabolic efficiency during food scarcity to respiratory function in ash-contaminated environments to psychological resilience during prolonged social isolation. The testing protocol analyzes genetic markers that control cold tolerance, starvation resistance, immune system function, stress hormone regulation, and cognitive flexibility under extreme conditions. But it also examines epigenetic modifications that affect how these genes are expressed, cultural knowledge transmission capabilities, and even psychological traits like risk assessment and cooperative behavior that were crucial for group survival during the TOBA crisis. The results have revealed shocking disparities in survival potential between different populations that challenge fundamental assumptions about human equality and social justice. Some genetic lineages show survival probabilities above 90% for supervolcanic conditions, while others show survival probabilities below 10%. These differences are not based on race or ethnicity in any conventional sense, but on the specific environmental pressures that different ancestral populations faced during previous catastrophic events. The populations with the highest survival ratings are those whose ancestors spent the most time in extreme environments during the post-TOBA recovery period. These include certain Arctic populations, high-altitude mountain communities, desert peoples, and island societies that had to develop sophisticated resource management strategies to survive in marginal environments. These populations show genetic variants that allow them to maintain cognitive function during food deprivation, regulate body temperature efficiently in extreme conditions, extract maximum nutrition from limited food sources, and coordinate group activities effectively under high-stress conditions. They also show cultural traits like resource-sharing protocols, environmental prediction skills, and technological innovations that were specifically developed for surviving resource scarcity. But the highest survival ratings do not necessarily correspond to the populations that most people would expect. Some indigenous communities that have maintained traditional lifestyles show exceptional genetic and cultural preparation for supervolcanic conditions, while some technologically advanced populations show surprisingly low survival potential because their genetic lineages lack the specific adaptations necessary for surviving without modern infrastructure. The testing has revealed that urban populations in developed countries generally show the lowest survival probabilities because their genetic lineages have been selected for success in stable, resource-abundant environments rather than for resilience during catastrophic events. These populations have lost many of the metabolic, immune system, and psychological adaptations that were essential for surviving the TOBA crisis. Conversely, populations that have experienced recent environmental hardships show much higher survival potential because the stress of these experiences has activated dormant genetic capabilities and preserved cultural knowledge that would be crucial during supervolcanic conditions. This includes populations that have survived famines, natural disasters, wars, and forced migrations within the past few generations. The genetic analysis has also identified specific geographical regions where human populations developed unique survival advantages based on local environmental conditions during the post-TOBA period. The descendants of people who survived in coastal refuges show enhanced abilities to extract resources from marine environments and resist the toxic effects of contaminated water supplies. The descendants of mountain survivors show superior respiratory function in low-oxygen environments and enhanced cold tolerance that would be crucial during volcanic winter conditions. The descendants of forest survivors show improved immune system function and enhanced ability to identify edible plants and animals during ecological disruptions. But perhaps the most surprising discovery has been the identification of genetic variants that enhance social cooperation and leadership abilities during crisis conditions. These variants affect neurotransmitter systems that regulate trust, empathy, and group coordination in ways that become activated specifically during high-stress survival situations. The populations that show the highest frequencies of these cooperation variants are those whose ancestors survived multiple catastrophic events and had to repeatedly form effective survival groups under extreme conditions. This suggests that social survival skills are not just cultural phenomena, but have actual genetic components that can be inherited and enhanced through natural selection. The testing protocol has been applied to more than 50,000 individuals from populations around the world, creating the first comprehensive database of human survival potential for supervolcanic conditions. The results show clear geographical patterns that correspond to the environmental history of different regions and the specific survival challenges that past populations faced. But the database has also revealed that individual genetic profiles can vary dramatically even within populations that show similar average survival ratings. Some individuals from populations with generally low survival potential show exceptional genetic advantages that would make them highly likely to survive supervolcanic conditions. Conversely, some individuals from high survival populations lack the specific genetic variants that would be necessary for crisis survival. This individual variation means that survival potential cannot be predicted accurately based on ancestry or population membership alone. Personal genetic testing is necessary to determine individual survival probabilities, and these probabilities can be significantly improved through lifestyle modifications, skill development, and social network building that activate dormant genetic capabilities. The research has identified specific training protocols that can enhance survival potential regardless of baseline genetic advantages. These protocols focus on metabolic conditioning, stress response training, social cooperation skills, and technical knowledge acquisition that can compensate for genetic disadvantages and amplify genetic advantages. Metabolic conditioning involves practices like intermittent fasting, cold exposure, and high-altitude training that activate genetic pathways associated with resource scarcity adaptation. These practices essentially train the body to function efficiently under the kind of nutritional and environmental stress that would characterize supervolcanic conditions. Stress response training includes meditation, breath work, and controlled exposure to challenging situations that improve psychological resilience and cognitive function under pressure. These practices help individuals access the enhanced mental capabilities that were developed during the TOBA crisis, but that remain dormant under normal modern conditions. Social cooperation training involves group decision-making exercises, resource-sharing simulations, and leadership development that strengthen the interpersonal skills necessary for effective survival group formation. These skills are particularly important because individual survival during supervolcanic events is virtually impossible regardless of genetic advantages. But the most important discovery from the survival ranking research has been the identification of optimal group composition strategies for maximizing collective survival probability. The genetic analysis shows that survival groups with diverse genetic backgrounds consistently outperform groups with similar genetic profiles, even when the similar groups have individually higher survival ratings. This diversity advantage occurs because different genetic lineages contribute different survival capabilities that become complementary during crisis conditions. Groups that include individuals with superior cold tolerance, resource extraction abilities, immune system function, and social coordination skills can collectively overcome challenges that would be impossible for any individual to handle alone. The optimal survival group size appears to be between 15 and 30 individuals, which provides enough genetic and skill diversity to handle multiple simultaneous challenges while maintaining the social cohesion necessary for effective decision-making under stress. Larger groups become difficult to coordinate and may exceed local resource capacity, while smaller groups lack the diversity necessary to handle complex survival challenges. The research has also identified specific geographical locations that provide the best survival probabilities for different genetic profiles. These locations are not necessarily the most obvious choices based on surface conditions, but are areas where geological, climatic, and ecological factors combine to create the most favorable environments for surviving supervolcanic winters. Some of these optimal survival locations are in regions that most people would consider uninhabitable under normal conditions, including remote islands, mountain valleys, desert oases, and Arctic coastal areas. But these locations have geological and ecological characteristics that would provide crucial advantages during supervolcanic conditions, including geothermal heat sources, protected water supplies, and ecosystems that would remain productive even under reduced sunlight conditions. The genetic testing research has also revealed disturbing information about how modern lifestyle factors are degrading the survival capabilities that humans inherited from their TOBA ancestors. Processed food diets, sedentary lifestyles, chronic stress, and exposure to industrial toxins are all reducing the expression of genetic variants that are crucial for surviving environmental catastrophes. Urban populations show particularly dramatic reductions in survival-related genetic expression compared to rural populations, suggesting that city living actively suppresses the biological systems that would be necessary for surviving supervolcanic conditions. This effect occurs even in individuals who carry high numbers of survival, advantageous genetic variants, indicating that genetic potential alone is not sufficient without appropriate environmental activation. The research has identified specific lifestyle interventions that can restore and enhance survival-related genetic expression within relatively short time periods. These interventions include dietary modifications, exercise protocols, environmental exposure practices, and social activities that essentially reprogram genetic expression to optimize survival capabilities. But the most concerning discovery has been that many of the populations with the highest survival potential are also those that are most threatened by current social and environmental changes. Indigenous communities that have maintained traditional lifestyles often show exceptional genetic and cultural preparation for supervolcanic survival. But these communities are being rapidly displaced by development, climate change, and cultural assimilation. The loss of these high survival potential populations represents a catastrophic reduction in human species resilience that could dramatically reduce overall survival chances during the next supervolcanic event. Preserving and supporting these communities is not just a matter of cultural diversity or social justice, but a critical component of species-level disaster preparedness. The survival ranking research has created ethical dilemmas that challenge conventional assumptions about equality, resource allocation, and social responsibility. If genetic testing can predict individual survival probabilities with high accuracy, should this information be used to guide evacuation priorities, resource distribution, and group formation strategies during emergencies? Should individuals with high survival potential have different obligations to participate in disaster preparedness activities? Should communities with low average survival ratings receive additional resources and training to improve their collective resilience? Should survival advantageous genetic variants be considered in immigration policies, employment decisions, or reproductive choices? These questions become even more complex when combined with the reality that survival during supervolcanic events will depend heavily on group cooperation and resource sharing. Optimizing individual survival chances may conflict with optimizing collective survival outcomes, especially if high survival individuals choose to form exclusive groups rather than supporting broader community resilience. The genetic analysis suggests that the most effective survival strategy involves combining high survival potential individuals with comprehensive community preparation rather than relying exclusively on either genetic advantages or population-level planning. This approach requires both individual optimization of survival capabilities and collective development of resource sharing, decision-making, and mutual support systems. But the timeline for implementing these strategies is extremely limited, according to the AI predictions discussed in the previous section. The window for genetic optimization, skill development, and community preparation is closing rapidly as geological conditions approach critical thresholds for supervolcanic activation. The survival ranking research provides unprecedented information about human resilience potential. But this information is only useful if individuals and communities act on it quickly enough to improve their preparation before the next catastrophic event begins. The genetic testing protocols are available now, The training methods have been developed and tested, and the optimal survival strategies have been identified and validated. The question is whether people will use this information to enhance their survival capabilities, or whether they will ignore it until the ash starts falling and it becomes too late to implement the genetic, social, and technical preparations that could make the difference between survival and extinction during the next supervolcanic winter. What if I told you that right now, as you listen to this, there are seismic monitoring stations around Yellowstone that are recording earthquake patterns identical to those that preceded the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980, except these patterns are occurring simultaneously across multiple supervolcanic sites on different continents? And what if I told you that government scientists have been ordered to classify this information to prevent public panic while they implement emergency protocols that prioritize government survival over public safety? The evidence for imminent supervolcanic activation is hiding in plain sight across multiple monitoring networks, but the data is being systematically suppressed and misrepresented to maintain social stability, while official preparations focus exclusively on preserving government continuity rather than protecting civilian populations. The Yellowstone Volcano Observatory maintains one of the most sophisticated geological monitoring networks ever deployed, with more than 3,000 individual sensors measuring seismic activity, ground deformation, gas emissions, and thermal changes across the entire Yellowstone caldera system. But the data from this network is not being reported accurately to the public because the actual measurements show activation patterns that would cause mass panic if their true implications were understood. Ground deformation measurements show that the Yellowstone caldera has been rising and falling in cycles that are becoming more frequent and more extreme with each repetition. These deformation patterns are not the gradual, steady changes that would be expected from normal geothermal activity. They are rapid, synchronized movements that indicate massive magma chamber pressurization, followed by partial pressure release in cycles that are characteristic of pre-eruption conditions. But the most alarming data comes from the Seismic Monitoring Network, which has been detecting earthquake swarms that follow specific patterns identified in historical eruptions at other volcanic sites. These patterns include initial deep earthquakes that indicate magma movement at depth, followed by shallower earthquakes that suggest magma approaching the surface, followed by harmonic tremor patterns that occur when magma begins moving through conduit systems toward eruption points. The Yellowstone seismic data shows all three phases of this pattern occurring simultaneously across different sections of the caldera, suggesting that magma movement is occurring throughout the entire system rather than being confined to isolated areas. This synchronized activity indicates that the Yellowstone system is approaching a state of critical instability that could trigger a major eruption with very little additional provocation. Similar patterns are being detected at other supervolcanic sites around the world. The Campi Flegrei caldera in Italy has been showing increased seismic activity and ground deformation for more than a decade, with acceleration rates that suggest a transition from dormant to active status. The TOBA caldera itself shows seismic activity patterns that indicate renewed magma chamber development beneath the existing lake system. But here is what makes the current situation unprecedented in human history. For the first time since modern monitoring began, multiple supervolcanic systems are showing synchronized activation patterns that suggest they are responding to the same underlying geological processes. This synchronization indicates that the global volcanic network identified by AI analysis is not just a theoretical model, but an active system that is currently approaching critical thresholds. The synchronization patterns are most evident in the timing correlations between seismic events at different sites. When major earthquake swarms occur at Yellowstone, similar swarms occur at Campi Flegrei within days or weeks. When ground deformation accelerates at one site, corresponding deformation changes occur at other sites with timing that cannot be explained as coincidence. These correlations suggest that the supervolcanic sites are connected through deep mantle processes that operate on global scales. When pressure buildup reaches critical levels in one system, it affects pressure distribution throughout the entire global network, potentially triggering cascade effects that could activate multiple systems simultaneously. But the most disturbing evidence comes from gas emission monitoring, which shows atmospheric changes that indicate volcanic activity levels far higher than any eruption in recorded history. Sulfur dioxide concentrations in the upper atmosphere have been increasing steadily for more than 5 years, reaching levels that can only be explained by sustained volcanic emissions from multiple sources. These atmospheric changes are not being reported as volcanic activity because they occur gradually rather than in the dramatic spikes associated with visible eruptions. But the cumulative effect of sustained low-level emissions from multiple volcanic systems can create atmospheric conditions similar to those that would result from a major eruption, including temperature reduction and climate disruption. The atmospheric monitoring data shows that global temperatures have already begun declining due to increased volcanic aerosol concentrations. But this cooling is being attributed to other factors, including solar radiation cycles and industrial pollution, rather than being recognized as evidence of increased volcanic activity. This misattribution of cause allows the volcanic emissions to continue increasing without triggering the emergency response protocols that would be activated if the true source of the climate changes were acknowledged. But the clearest evidence for imminent supervolcanic activation comes from monitoring systems that are not officially part of the volcanic surveillance network. Military seismic detection systems designed to monitor nuclear weapons testing have been detecting underground acoustic signals that match the signatures of massive magma movement events. These signals indicate that magma chamber inflation and pressurization is occurring at scales much larger than anything detected by civilian monitoring networks. The military monitoring data suggests that the current geological instability extends far beyond the known supervolcanic sites to include vast underground magma systems that have not been previously identified or mapped. These hidden systems may be components of the global volcanic network that are now becoming active for the satellite thermal imaging data shows heat signature anomalies at dozens of locations around the world that correspond to areas where underground geological activity would indicate magma movement or hydrothermal system activation. Many of these thermal anomalies are in locations that have never been considered volcanically active, suggesting that the current geological instability is reactivating dormant volcanic systems that have been inactive for tens of thousands of years. The combination of synchronized seismic activity, coordinated ground deformation, sustained atmospheric emissions, military acoustic detection, and satellite thermal imaging all point to the same conclusion. The global volcanic system is currently in the early stages of a major activation event that will culminate in supervolcanic eruptions at multiple sites within a relatively short time period. But government response to this evidence has focused entirely on preserving institutional continuity rather than protecting public welfare. Classified emergency response protocols show that government agencies are preparing for extended periods of social collapse and infrastructure failure without making any attempt to prevent these outcomes or to help civilian populations prepare for survival under catastrophic conditions. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has been quietly stockpiling supplies and equipment at classified storage facilities since 2018, but these stockpiles are designed to support government operations rather than civilian relief efforts. The supplies include food reserves for up to 5 years, medical equipment, communication systems, and transportation resources that would allow government agencies to maintain operations even after complete breakdown of normal infrastructure. But there has been no corresponding effort to develop civilian supply reserves or to implement public education programs that would help ordinary people prepare for supervolcanic conditions. Instead, government agencies have focused on maintaining public confidence in normal institutions while secretly preparing for scenarios in which those institutions will become completely non-functional. Military planning documents show that armed forces are being repositioned to protect government facilities and supply reserves rather than to provide disaster relief or public safety services. The military preparations assume that civilian populations will become hostile toward government operations during extended crisis conditions and include protocols for defending government assets against domestic threats. These preparations reveal the fundamental assumption underlying official response planning. Government agencies expect civilian populations to die in large numbers during supervolcanic events, and their planning focuses on maintaining government control over surviving populations rather than maximizing overall survival rates. The classified evacuation plans for government personnel include detailed timelines for implementing these evacuations based on specific geological warning signs. But the warning signs that would trigger government evacuations are set at much lower threat levels than the warning signs that would trigger public evacuation recommendations. This means that government officials will be safely relocated to protected facilities before civilian populations are even informed that evacuation might be necessary. The evacuation timeline shows that government agencies expect to have between 6 months and 2 years of advance warning before major supervolcanic eruptions occur. But this advance warning will not be shared with public populations until the final stages of the eruption sequence, when evacuation and preparation options will be severely limited. But here is what government planners have failed to consider. The current monitoring data suggests that the warning timeline may be much shorter than the official plans assume. The synchronized activation patterns at multiple sites indicate that the geological system is approaching critical thresholds faster than any historical precedent would predict. AI analysis of current monitoring data suggests that major eruptions could begin within months rather than years, and that the traditional warning signs may be compressed into much shorter time periods than government plans anticipate. This acceleration means that even the classified government preparations may be inadequate for the actual timeline of events that is now developing. More importantly, the government plans assume that communication systems, transportation networks, and supply chains will remain functional during the early stages of supervolcanic activation. But the current atmospheric and seismic changes suggest that infrastructure disruption may begin long before major eruptions occur, making it impossible to implement evacuation and supply distribution plans that depend on normal logistical capabilities. The atmospheric changes that are already occurring include increased electrical activity, magnetic field fluctuations, and atmospheric pressure variations that can disrupt electronic communications and navigation systems. The seismic activity that is currently being detected can damage transportation infrastructure, interrupt power supplies, and interfere with computer network operations that modern logistics systems require for coordination. These infrastructure vulnerabilities mean that government continuity plans may become impossible to implement even if adequate warning time is available. The agencies that are supposed to coordinate emergency response may lose the ability to communicate with each other or to control the resources they have been stockpiling for crisis conditions. But the most serious flaw in government planning is the assumption that maintaining official authority structures will be useful or possible during extended supervolcanic conditions. Historical analysis shows that formal government institutions typically collapse during civilizational-level disasters, being replaced by local leadership structures that emerge from immediate survival communities. The people who end up coordinating effective survival efforts during major disasters are not the officials who held formal authority before the crisis began. They are the individuals who can organize practical responses to immediate survival challenges and who can earn the trust and cooperation of people who are facing life-threatening conditions. Government officials hiding in underground bunkers will be irrelevant to the survival challenges that ordinary people will face during supervolcanic winter conditions. The real survival work will be done by local communities that can organize resource sharing, collective decision-making, and mutual support systems without depending on external authority or technological infrastructure. This means that the most important preparation for supervolcanic events is not stockpiling supplies or building bunkers, but developing the social relationships and practical skills that will be necessary for community-level survival organization. The genetic advantages and traditional knowledge systems discussed in previous sections will only be useful if they can be applied through effective group cooperation and resource-sharing protocols. But the time available for developing these capabilities is extremely limited, according to current monitoring data. The geological evidence suggests that major activation events could begin within the current calendar year, making immediate preparation essential for anyone who wants to maximize their survival chances during the approaching crisis. The monitoring networks that are supposed to provide early warning are either suppressing critical information or may be overwhelmed by the rapid pace of geological changes that are currently occurring. The government agencies that are supposed to coordinate emergency response are focused on their own survival rather than public protection. The infrastructure systems that modern civilization depends on are already being disrupted by atmospheric and seismic changes that will become much more severe as geological instability increases. You now have access to information about current threat levels that is not available through official channels. The question is whether you will use this information to begin immediate preparation for survival conditions that may begin much sooner than anyone is publicly predicting, or whether you will wait for official warnings that may never come or may come too late to allow effective preparation. What if I told you that the cognitive abilities that make you human were not developed through gradual evolution over millions of years, but were rapidly created during the TOBA starvation crisis, when your ancestors' brains literally rewired themselves in response to extreme hunger? And what if I told you that modern obesity and processed food consumption are systematically reversing these survival adaptations and making your brain less capable of handling the next supervolcanic crisis? The research connecting nutrition, brain function, and evolutionary adaptation has revealed that the TOBA survivors developed enhanced cognitive capabilities specifically because they were starving, and that understanding this relationship is crucial for preparing your brain to function effectively during the next period of global food scarcity. The human brain consumes approximately 20% of your body's total energy requirements, despite representing only 2% of your body weight. This massive energy consumption made brain function extremely vulnerable during the food scarcity that characterized the TOBA volcanic winter. Most animals respond to starvation by reducing brain activity to conserve energy for basic survival functions. But human ancestors took the opposite approach, developing genetic and metabolic modifications that actually enhance brain function during periods of nutritional stress. This counterintuitive adaptation occurred because the survival challenges of the volcanic winter required unprecedented levels of cognitive performance. Finding food during environmental collapse required enhanced pattern recognition, long-term planning, creative problem-solving, and complex social coordination. The groups that could maintain and enhance these cognitive capabilities during starvation were the groups that survived. The groups that allowed brain function to decline during food scarcity died out completely. The result was rapid selection for genetic variants that supported brain function during nutritional stress and metabolic modifications that could fuel cognitive enhancement even when overall food availability was severely limited. These adaptations created what researchers now call the TOBA cognitive phenotype, a unique pattern of brain metabolism and neural organization that exists only in modern humans, and that was specifically designed for optimal function during resource scarcity. The TOBA cognitive phenotype includes several key features that distinguish modern human brains from those of other primates and earlier hominid species. First, it includes enhanced glucose utilization efficiency that allows the brain to extract maximum energy from limited food sources. Second, it includes modified neurotransmitter systems that maintain cognitive performance during stress hormone elevation associated with chronic hunger. Third, it includes enlarged prefrontal cortex regions that support the complex planning and decision-making necessary for survival in unstable environments. But the most remarkable feature of the TOBA cognitive phenotype is its dependence on what researchers call adaptive stress metabolism. Under normal nutritional conditions, this metabolic system operates at baseline levels that provide adequate cognitive function for routine activities. But when nutritional stress occurs, the system shifts into an enhanced mode that actually improves cognitive performance above normal levels. This stress-enhanced cognition explains several puzzling features of human psychology and behavior. It explains why many people report enhanced mental clarity and creativity during fasting periods. It explains why mild food restriction often improves cognitive test performance rather than impairing it. It explains why human societies have consistently developed cultural practices involving periodic fasting, food restrictions, and ritualized hunger that seem to contradict basic survival instincts. These cultural practices are not arbitrary religious or social customs. They are behavioral technologies that activate the enhanced cognitive capabilities that were developed during the TOBA crisis. Fasting, intermittent food restriction, and controlled hunger trigger the metabolic systems that optimize brain function for survival challenges and enhance the pattern recognition, planning, and problem-solving abilities that were essential for surviving volcanic winter conditions. Modern neuroscience has identified the specific biological mechanisms that underlie TOBA cognitive enhancement. During periods of nutritional stress, the brain increases production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that promotes the growth of new neural connections and enhances synaptic plasticity. It also increases production of ketone bodies, alternative fuel sources that provide more efficient energy for neural activity than glucose metabolism alone. Additionally, nutritional stress triggers changes in neurotransmitter regulation that enhance focus, reduce distractibility, and improve working memory capacity. These changes occur through modification of dopamine and norepinephrine systems that are normally suppressed during well-fed conditions, but that become activated when the brain detects resource scarcity signals. The combination of enhanced neural connectivity, improved energy efficiency, and optimized neurotransmitter function creates a cognitive state that significantly exceeds normal brain performance in areas that were crucial for TOBA survival. These include spatial reasoning for navigation and resource location, social cognition for group coordination and cooperation, temporal reasoning for planning and resource allocation, and creative problem-solving for technological innovation and adaptation. But these cognitive enhancements only occur when the brain detects genuine nutritional stress signals that indicate resource scarcity conditions. Modern food abundance and processed food consumption create metabolic conditions that suppress the activation of TOBA cognitive systems, leaving most people operating at cognitive baseline levels that are far below their genetic potential. The typical modern diet of constant food availability, high sugar intake, and processed food consumption creates metabolic signals that tell the brain that resources are abundant and that enhanced cognitive performance is unnecessary. This nutritional environment actively prevents the activation of the stress metabolism systems that were essential for TOBA survival and that remain necessary for optimal cognitive function during crisis conditions. Even more problematic, modern food processing removes many of the nutritional components that are necessary for supporting enhanced brain function during stress conditions. Refined sugars provide rapid energy but lack the micronutrients necessary for neurotransmitter synthesis. Processed fats interfere with the production of ketone bodies that serve as alternative brain fuel during resource scarcity. Artificial additives and preservatives disrupt the stress response systems that trigger cognitive enhancement. The result is that most modern people have cognitive capabilities that are actually inferior to those of their TOBA ancestors, despite having access to far more nutritional resources. They have been metabolically programmed for cognitive complacency rather than cognitive excellence, and their brains are unprepared for the enhanced performance that will be necessary for surviving the next supervolcanic winter. But the research has also identified specific nutritional protocols that can reactivate TOBA cognitive systems and restore the enhanced brain function that was developed during the volcanic winter crisis. These protocols involve strategic food restriction, nutrient timing, and dietary composition modifications that recreate the metabolic conditions necessary for stress-enhanced cognition. Intermittent fasting represents the most direct method for activating TOBA cognitive enhancement. By creating controlled periods of nutritional stress, intermittent fasting triggers the metabolic shifts that enhance brain-derived neurotrophic factor production, increase ketone body utilization, and optimize neurotransmitter function for enhanced cognitive performance. But effective intermittent fasting for cognitive enhancement requires specific timing and duration protocols that match the nutritional stress patterns that characterize the TOBA survival period. Random meal skipping or arbitrary fasting schedules do not create the consistent metabolic signals necessary for activating enhanced cognitive systems. The optimal fasting protocol for TOBA cognitive activation involves 16 to 24-hour fasting periods occurring 2 to 3 times per week, with feeding periods focused on nutrient-dense foods that support neurotransmitter synthesis and neural connectivity. This schedule recreates the irregular food availability that characterized TOBA survival conditions while providing the nutritional support necessary for maintaining enhanced brain function. The feeding periods must include specific nutrients that were available to TOBA survivors and that are necessary for supporting stress-enhanced cognition. These include omega-3 fatty acids from wild fish and game that support neural membrane function and reduce inflammation. They include complex carbohydrates from wild plants that provide sustained energy without triggering insulin spikes that interfere with ketone production. They include micronutrients from organ meats and wild plants that support neurotransmitter synthesis and stress response optimization. But dietary composition alone is not sufficient for full activation of TOBA cognitive systems. The enhanced brain function that was developed during the volcanic winter also required specific types of cognitive challenges that engage the enhanced planning, problem-solving, and social coordination capabilities that were essential for survival. Modern life typically provides cognitive challenges that are either too simple to engage enhanced cognitive systems or too artificial to trigger the survival-related brain functions that were developed during TOBA. Routine work activities, entertainment consumption, and social media engagement do not create the cognitive demands that activate stress-enhanced brain function. Effective cognitive training for TOBA system activation requires activities that recreate the types of mental challenges that characterize volcanic winter survival. These include complex navigation tasks that engage spatial reasoning systems, resource allocation problems that require long-term planning and risk assessment, group coordination exercises that engage social cognition and leadership capabilities, and creative problem-solving challenges that require innovative thinking under pressure. The most effective cognitive training protocols combine nutritional stress with challenging mental activities that recreate TOBA survival conditions. This combination triggers both the metabolic enhancement systems and the cognitive challenge responses that were essential for volcanic winter survival. Physical conditioning also plays a crucial role in activating TOBA cognitive systems because enhanced brain function during the volcanic winter was integrated with enhanced physical capabilities that were necessary for survival activities like hunting, gathering, tool making, and shelter construction. The brain enhancements that were developed during TOBA were not isolated cognitive improvements, but were components of integrated survival systems that coordinated mental and physical performance. Cold exposure represents one of the most important physical conditioning methods for activating TOBA cognitive systems. The volcanic winter created extended periods of cold stress that required enhanced cognitive function for survival strategy development and implementation. Modern cold exposure through controlled cold water immersion, winter outdoor activities, and reduced heating creates similar stress conditions that trigger both metabolic enhancement and cognitive optimization. But cold exposure for TOBA system activation must be combined with cognitive challenges that engage the enhanced brain functions that were developed during the volcanic winter. Simple cold exposure without accompanying mental demands does not fully activate the integrated cognitive and physical systems that characterize TOBA survival adaptations. Sleep optimization also represents a crucial component of TOBA cognitive activation because the volcanic winter required enhanced sleep efficiency to maintain cognitive performance despite reduced food availability and increased environmental stress. TOBA survivors developed modified sleep patterns that maximize cognitive recovery while minimizing energy expenditure. Modern sleep research has identified the specific sleep modifications that enhance cognitive performance during stress conditions. These include increased deep sleep duration for memory consolidation and neural recovery, reduced REM sleep fragmentation that interferes with creative problem solving, and optimized sleep timing that aligns with natural circadian rhythms rather than artificial light schedules. The optimal sleep protocol for TOBA cognitive activation involves 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night with consistent sleep and wake times that align with natural light cycles. This schedule must be combined with elimination of artificial light exposure during evening hours that interferes with natural melatonin production and sleep quality optimization. But sleep optimization alone is not sufficient for full TOBA cognitive activation. The enhanced sleep efficiency that was developed during the volcanic winter was integrated with enhanced stress response systems that allowed cognitive performance to be maintained even when optimal sleep was not available due to survival demands. Stress inoculation training represents a crucial component of TOBA cognitive preparation because the volcanic winter required cognitive performance to be maintained during conditions of extreme psychological stress, including fear, uncertainty, social conflict, and life-threatening challenges. The enhanced cognitive systems that were developed during TOBA included built-in stress resistance that prevented cognitive degradation during crisis conditions. Modern stress inoculation can recreate these resistance capabilities through controlled exposure to challenging situations that engage stress response systems while requiring maintained cognitive performance. These include high-stakes decision-making exercises, time-pressure problem-solving challenges, social conflict resolution scenarios, and physical challenge activities that require cognitive performance despite physical stress. The most effective stress inoculation protocols progressively increase challenge levels while providing recovery periods that allow stress response systems to adapt and strengthen. This approach builds stress resistance capabilities gradually, rather than overwhelming stress response systems with challenges that exceed adaptive capacity. Social coordination training represents another essential component of TOBA cognitive preparation because the enhanced brain functions that were developed during the volcanic winter were specifically designed for group survival rather than individual performance. The cognitive enhancements that allowed TOBA survivors to navigate the volcanic winter were integrated with enhanced social cognition and cooperation capabilities that enabled effective group formation and resource sharing. Modern social coordination training can reactivate these capabilities through group problem-solving exercises, resource allocation simulations, leadership rotation practices, and conflict resolution scenarios that recreate the social challenges that characterize TOBA survival conditions. But social coordination training must involve real stakes and genuine interdependence, rather than artificial team-building exercises that do not engage the survival-related social cognition systems that were developed during the volcanic winter. Effective training requires situations where group success or failure has meaningful consequences and where individual performance affects group outcomes in ways that matter to all participants. The integration of nutritional protocols, cognitive training, physical conditioning, sleep optimization, stress inoculation, and social coordination creates a comprehensive system for reactivating the enhanced cognitive capabilities that were developed during the TOBA volcanic winter. But this system requires consistent practice and progressive challenge increases over extended time periods to fully activate the genetic and metabolic systems that support stress-enhanced cognition. The timeline for achieving full TOBA cognitive activation varies depending on individual genetic background, current fitness levels, and training consistency. Most people can achieve significant cognitive enhancement within 3 to 6 months of consistent protocol implementation. Full activation of stress-enhanced cognitive systems typically requires 12 to 18 months of progressive training and conditioning, but the current geological timeline suggests that the window for cognitive preparation may be much shorter than optimal training periods would require. The monitoring data indicating imminent supervolcanic activation means that cognitive enhancement protocols must be implemented immediately and intensively rather than gradually to provide maximum benefit during the approaching crisis. This urgency means that cognitive preparation protocols must be prioritized over other preparation activities that require longer time periods or more complex resource acquisition. Nutritional modifications, fasting protocols, and basic cognitive training can be implemented immediately without specialized equipment or extensive preparation. The most important immediate steps for activating TOBA cognitive systems include eliminating processed foods and implementing intermittent fasting schedules, beginning cold exposure and physical conditioning programs, optimizing sleep schedules and eliminating artificial light exposure, engaging in challenging cognitive activities that require planning and problem solving, and participating in group coordination and leadership activities that engage social cognition systems. These basic protocols will begin activating enhanced cognitive capabilities within weeks of implementation and will provide significant cognitive advantages during crisis conditions, even if full TOBA system activation is not achieved before supervolcanic events begin. But the ultimate effectiveness of cognitive enhancement depends on understanding that the brain modifications developed during TOBA were not temporary emergency responses, but were permanent evolutionary adaptations that remain active in modern human populations. The enhanced cognitive capabilities that allowed your ancestors to survive the volcanic winter are still present in your genetic code, waiting to be activated by the appropriate nutritional, physical, and social conditions. The next supervolcanic winter will require the same types of enhanced cognitive performance that characterize TOBA survival. Pattern recognition for resource location, long-term planning for resource allocation, creative problem-solving for technological adaptation, and social coordination for group survival will again become the determining factors for who survives and who does not. The difference is that you have the opportunity to activate these capabilities before the crisis begins, rather than being forced to develop them under survival conditions as your ancestors were. The nutritional protocols, training methods, and conditioning systems necessary for cognitive enhancement are available now and can be implemented immediately by anyone who understands their importance for surviving the approaching geological catastrophe. But this opportunity will not last indefinitely. The current geological timeline suggests that major supervolcanic events could begin within months, making immediate cognitive preparation essential for maximizing survival chances during the next period of global environmental collapse. Your ancestors survived the Toba volcanic winter, not because they were lucky or because they had better technology, but because they developed enhanced cognitive capabilities that allowed them to outthink and outplan the environmental challenges that nearly ended human civilization. Those same capabilities exist in you, encoded in your DNA and waiting to be activated through the same nutritional and physical conditions that originally created them. The question is whether you will recognize the importance of cognitive preparation and implement the protocols necessary for activating your inherited survival capabilities, or whether you will continue operating at cognitive baseline levels that may be inadequate for surviving the complex challenges that the next supervolcanic winter will create. What if I told you that the psychological trauma of the Toba volcanic winter was so severe that it permanently altered human consciousness and created mental patterns that still control your behavior 74,000 years later? And what if I told you that understanding these embedded psychological responses is the key to both surviving the next supervolcanic event and breaking free from the unconscious fears that limit your potential in normal times? The research into trauma inheritance, epigenetic psychology, and evolutionary psychiatry has revealed that modern human mental architecture was fundamentally shaped by the collective psychological crisis of volcanic winter survival, creating both survival advantages and psychological vulnerabilities that continue to influence every aspect of human behavior. The Toba survivors did not just experience temporary stress that ended when environmental conditions improved. They experienced prolonged psychological trauma that lasted for years and that fundamentally rewired human emotional and cognitive responses to uncertainty, scarcity, social conflict, and environmental change. This trauma was so intense and so prolonged that it created permanent modifications in brain structure and neurotransmitter function that were passed down through both genetic and epigenetic inheritance to every subsequent generation. Modern neuroscience has identified specific brain regions and neural circuits that show clear evidence of trauma-related modifications that correspond to the timing and characteristics of the Toba event. The human amygdala, which processes fear and threat detection, is enlarged compared to other primate species and shows enhanced connectivity to prefrontal cortex regions involved in planning and decision-making. This enlarged fear processing system allows humans to detect and respond to potential threats much more quickly and thoroughly than other animals. But it also creates susceptibility to anxiety disorders and hypervigilance that can be maladaptive under safe conditions. The human hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which controls stress hormone production, shows modifications that create rapid and intense stress responses to perceived threats, but that also create difficulties returning to baseline relaxation states after threats have passed. This modified stress response system was essential for survival during the prolonged crisis conditions of the volcanic winter, but it creates chronic stress and anxiety symptoms in modern environments where immediate threats are rare. Most significantly, the human prefrontal cortex shows unique developmental patterns that create enhanced planning and worry capabilities, but that also creates susceptibility to rumination, obsessive thinking, and depression. The ability to mentally simulate future scenarios and potential problems was crucial for survival during the volcanic winter, but the same cognitive systems create psychological suffering when they focus on imaginary threats and hypothetical problems that may never occur. These trauma-related brain modifications are not individual quirks or personal weaknesses. They are species-wide psychological adaptations that exist in every modern human and that influence behavior even when people are completely unaware of their evolutionary origins. Understanding these inherited psychological patterns is crucial for both optimizing survival capabilities and managing the psychological challenges that these patterns create in modern life. The most fundamental psychological legacy of Toba is what researchers call anticipatory anxiety, a uniquely human tendency to experience stress and fear in response to imagined future threats rather than only reacting to immediate dangers. This psychological pattern was essential during the volcanic winter because survival required constant vigilance and preparation for potential problems that might occur days, weeks, or months in the future. But anticipatory anxiety becomes problematic in modern environments, where most imagined threats never materialize, and where constant worry about hypothetical problems interferes with enjoyment of present moment experiences and productive engagement with actual challenges. The same mental systems that enhance survival planning during the volcanic winter create unnecessary psychological suffering when they focus on remote possibilities and worst-case scenarios that are unlikely to occur. The key to managing inherited anticipatory anxiety is understanding that these responses were designed for environments characterized by genuine scarcity and constant threat rather than for the relative safety and abundance of modern civilization. When anticipatory anxiety responses are triggered by modern situations, they often represent evolutionary mismatch rather than appropriate responses to actual threats. But the current geological evidence suggests that the environmental conditions that originally created these psychological responses may be approaching again. The next supervolcanic winter will create exactly the kind of prolonged uncertainty and resource scarcity that these inherited anxiety systems were designed to navigate. Understanding how to channel anticipatory anxiety into productive preparation and planning, rather than allowing it to create paralyzing worry, will be crucial for psychological survival during the approaching crisis. Another major psychological legacy of TOBA is what researchers call social hypervigilance, an enhanced sensitivity to social dynamics, group membership, and potential social conflict that far exceeds the social awareness of other primate species. This enhanced social cognition was essential during the volcanic winter because survival required forming and maintaining cooperative groups under conditions of extreme stress and resource competition. The TOBA survivors had to constantly monitor group dynamics for signs of potential conflict, identify reliable cooperation partners, detect potential social threats, and navigate complex resource-sharing negotiations. These social survival skills required psychological capabilities that were far more sophisticated than anything that had existed in previous human populations. But social hypervigilance creates psychological vulnerabilities in modern environments, where it manifests as excessive concern about social approval, susceptibility to peer pressure, social anxiety in group situations, and tendency to interpret neutral social interactions as potentially threatening. The same psychological systems that enhance group survival during the volcanic winter can create social paralysis and relationship difficulties when they are triggered by modern social situations that do not actually involve survival threats. The key to managing inherited social hypervigilance is understanding when social situations actually require enhanced vigilance and cooperation versus when they are routine interactions that do not need intensive psychological monitoring. This discrimination requires developing what researchers call social context awareness, the ability to accurately assess whether social situations involve genuine cooperation requirements or potential threats versus routine social engagement that does not require survival-level social cognition. But the approaching supervolcanic crisis will create social conditions that are much more similar to those that originally shaped human social psychology. The next volcanic winter will require exactly the kind of intense social cooperation and group coordination that these inherited psychological systems were designed to support. Learning to activate and channel social hypervigilance productively, rather than being overwhelmed by its intensity, will be crucial for forming effective survival groups during the approaching crisis. A third major psychological legacy of TOBA is what researchers call scarcity programming, a deep psychological orientation toward resource conservation, hoarding behavior, and competitive acquisition that influences decision-making even when resources are abundant. This psychological pattern was essential during the volcanic winter because survival required maximizing resource acquisition during brief periods of availability and carefully rationing resources during extended periods of scarcity. But scarcity programming creates psychological and behavioral problems in modern environments of relative abundance, where hoarding behaviors interfere with resource sharing, competitive acquisition creates unnecessary social conflict, and excessive conservation prevents enjoyment of available resources. The same psychological drives that enhance resource management during the volcanic winter can create compulsive behaviors and relationship difficulties when they are triggered by modern situations that do not actually involve resource scarcity. The most problematic aspect of inherited scarcity programming is that it operates largely below conscious awareness and influences behavior even when people intellectually understand that resources are abundant and that competitive acquisition is unnecessary. Scarcity programming triggers emotional responses that override rational decision-making and create behaviors that are often counterproductive for achieving stated goals and values. Understanding and managing scarcity programming requires developing what researchers call abundance awareness, the ability to accurately assess actual resource availability and to distinguish between situations that require resource conservation versus situations where resource sharing and generous behavior are more appropriate. This awareness requires both intellectual understanding of resource availability and emotional regulation skills that can override inherited scarcity responses when they are triggered inappropriately. But the approaching supervolcanic crisis will create exactly the kind of resource scarcity conditions that originally shaped human resource psychology. The next volcanic winter will require precisely the kind of careful resource management and strategic resource acquisition that scarcity programming was designed to support. Learning to activate scarcity programming productively while avoiding its potentially destructive social effects will be crucial for individual and group survival during the approaching crisis. A fourth major psychological legacy of TOBA is what researchers call catastrophic thinking, a tendency to focus on worst-case scenarios and potential disasters that far exceeds the threat assessment capabilities of other species. This psychological pattern was adaptive during the volcanic winter because survival required constant preparation for multiple simultaneous disasters and the ability to plan for scenarios that were much worse than anything that had been previously experienced. But catastrophic thinking creates psychological problems in modern environments, where it manifests as excessive worry about unlikely negative outcomes, difficulty enjoying positive experiences due to anticipation of potential problems, and tendency to interpret minor setbacks as indicators of major disasters. The same mental systems that enhance disaster preparedness during the volcanic winter can create depression, anxiety, and paralysis when they focus on imaginary catastrophes that are unlikely to occur. The key to managing inherited catastrophic thinking is understanding when disaster preparation is actually appropriate versus when it represents psychological overreaction to normal uncertainties and minor challenges. This requires developing what researchers call proportional threat assessment, the ability to accurately evaluate actual risk levels and to allocate mental and emotional resources appropriately to genuine threats versus imaginary concerns. But current geological evidence suggests that the environmental conditions that originally made catastrophic thinking adaptive may be approaching again. The next supervolcanic winter will create exactly the kind of multiple simultaneous disasters that catastrophic thinking systems were designed to anticipate and prepare for. Learning to channel catastrophic thinking into productive disaster preparation, rather than allowing it to create paralyzing anxiety, will be crucial for psychological readiness during the approaching crisis. A fifth major psychological legacy of TOBA is what researchers call tribal identity formation, an enhanced tendency to form strong group loyalties and to distinguish sharply between group members and outsiders that creates both powerful cooperation capabilities and susceptibility to intergroup conflict. This psychological pattern was essential during the volcanic winter because survival required intense cooperation within groups and sometimes competition between groups for access to limited resources. But tribal identity formation creates psychological and social problems in modern environments where it manifests as racism, nationalism, religious extremism, and other forms of intergroup hostility that interfere with beneficial cooperation across group boundaries. The same psychological systems that enhanced in-group cooperation during the volcanic winter can create destructive conflict and prevent beneficial collaboration when they are triggered by modern social situations that do not actually require tribal competition. The key to managing inherited tribal identity formation is understanding when group loyalty and boundary maintenance are actually necessary for protection and cooperation versus when they prevent beneficial relationships and collaboration across group boundaries. This requires developing what researchers call flexible group identity, the ability to form strong, cooperative relationships within groups while maintaining openness to beneficial relationships with people from different groups. But the approaching supervolcanic crisis will create social conditions that require exactly the kind of intense group cooperation and coordination that tribal identity systems were designed to support. The next volcanic winter will require forming effective survival groups with clear membership boundaries and strong internal loyalty, while potentially competing with other groups for access to limited resources. Learning to activate tribal cooperation capabilities while avoiding destructive intergroup conflict will be crucial for social survival during the approaching crisis. Understanding these inherited psychological patterns is important, not just for managing their potentially problematic effects in modern life, but for recognizing when they represent appropriate responses to actual survival situations versus when they represent evolutionary mismatch. The current geological evidence suggests that the environmental conditions that originally shaped these psychological systems may be approaching again, making these inherited responses relevant for survival rather than just sources of psychological difficulty. But activating inherited psychological survival systems productively requires conscious understanding and deliberate management rather than unconscious automatic responses. The TOBA survivors who developed these psychological patterns were consciously aware of the survival challenges they faced and deliberately coordinated their psychological responses with group survival strategies. Modern people who want to benefit from these inherited capabilities must also develop conscious awareness and deliberate management skills. This conscious activation of inherited psychological systems requires specific training and practice that recreates the psychological challenges that originally shaped these systems while providing safe environments for developing management skills. Effective training includes controlled exposure to uncertainty and scarcity conditions, group cooperation exercises that engage tribal identity systems, threat assessment scenarios that engage catastrophic thinking capabilities, and social coordination challenges that engage